the pleasure of being here again. I'm not quite of Milton Friedman's generation. Not quite. It's sort of a petty point, but I'm a little bit younger than he is. Insert that into the record. I think a lot of people seem to have been afflicted with an excess of Friedman worship. So I'm not going to stress the good points that Friedman has done in the past few years. I think most people are familiar with it. I might even be so unkind as to paraphrase when Friedman's mentor, Henry Simons, wrote an article about Alvin Hansen one time, Hansen being the top left-wing Keynesian in the past years, now more or less retired. He wrote an article saying, he began the article by saying, "I come to bury Hansen, not to praise him." And I can say the same thing about Friedman tonight. In the first place, one of the problems with the press in general is that the press has a very short memory. So if somebody comes up with an idea and nobody said it for the last 3 years, it's immediately hailed as a great new idea, a great new discovery. And the same thing has happened to Friedman. Almost everything he says is a complete reincarnation of what, for example, Irving Fisher had said 40 years ago, 30 years ago. But since the collective memory of the press and even the economics profession is very short, nobody points this out. So Friedman has discovered all sorts of so-called laws, which are simply rediscoveries or restatements of what Fisher had said clearer, more in a clearer fashion, 40 years before. For example, there's a famous law that Friedman is supposed to have discovered a year or two ago, that the interest rate rises during inflation, especially during the later stages of inflation, because as prices are going up, we have a discount, a positive price discount, premium, or a positive price premium on the interest rate to account for the prices rising, so that if the creditor is demanding a 6% return, for example, and prices are going up 6% a year, obviously you have to ask a lot more than 6% to overcome the inflation. So Friedman's supposed to have this great new discovery, and the economics profession is now sort of in a tizzy about that. And of course, Fisher had said exactly the same thing about 40, 50 years ago, and Professor Mises has said the same thing in his work, and so forth. But they say the collective memory of the press and the economics profession is very, very short. And this is, as I will point out later on, this is true of Friedman's general theory about money in the business cycle. It's essentially Fisher rediscovered and with a lot of statistics added onto it. I'm going to talk tonight essentially about the political rather than the methodological critique of Friedman. I could say a lot about the methodology, but I think in this sort of gathering, I think we can stress the political economy aspect. I just want to say in passing that Friedman is probably the outstanding proponent in methodology of an extreme variant of logical positivism. In other words, the major opponent of Professor Mises' methodology, so to speak. Friedman is so extreme that he says that a theoretical assumption not only doesn't have to be proven, it can even be false and still be a correct theory. It doesn't matter if the assumptions are false, he says, as long as the predictions are correct, which are based on these false assumptions. So this is an extreme version of positivist methodology, and I'm saying this is the exact counter to everything that praxeology holds dear. But as I say, I don't want to talk about methodology tonight. I just want to mention that in passing. First, and I'm not going to deal too much with this either, is the whole field of monopoly and competition. Now, it's true that in practice, Friedman has come a long way from the original Henry Simons position. The original Henry Simons position, which was written in a really screwball book, I think in 1934, called A Positive Program for Laissez-Faire, which I recommend everybody read because it really states the Chicago school position very clearly, the political position of the Chicago school, with great clarity. And essentially Simons said was that every corporation above the size of a small blacksmith shop should be broken up, be trust busted by the government, and reduce down the blacksmith shop size so that we can all have perfect competition. We can enjoy the benefits of perfection and competition. And this, I say, was the original Chicago position. It's come quite away from that, happily. And Friedman today doesn't take this position. He says, well, he recognizes that the major source of monopoly today is government privileges, government regulation and subsidies and so forth. But still there's the canker there. The theory is still there. The theory being the Chicago position of perfect competition, in quotes, is better than imperfect. In other words, that a firm with a constant demand curve, a horizontal demand curve, is somehow better and superior and more pure, less and more moral than a firm in a state of which faces a falling demand curve. So that this idealization of perfect competition still remains, even though it's played down now in practice in the Friedman position. But it's still there to plague us in the future, because sometime in the future we'll get this. We'll again hear the cry from the Chicago school: such and such a corporation should be broken up because it's too big and it's facing a falling demand curve, and so forth. We can expect it at any time. Let's put it that way. Just as Professor Stiegler, Friedman's most distinguished associate, said about 15 years ago, the U.S. Steel should be broken up into its constituent parts because it was monopolistic. I don't know if he still says that. He's come a long way, too, from the last 20 years. But as I say, the theoretical structure still remains. But I don't want to deal too much with monopoly and competition either, because this is, again, more theoretical than a political position at the present time. Let's get to the Friedman's big argument for government intervention in general, which is the so-called neighborhood effect. And it's particularly, I want to talk about the external benefit part of neighborhood effect. In other words, the idea that if 2 or 3 people are doing something which another set of people are benefiting from but aren't paying for, this is a terrible, terrible thing, and these people should be forced to pay for it. This is one version of it. Now, in practice, Friedman doesn't push this to a great extent. He essentially says, well, this is really limited. We limit the application of this to urban parks, Central Park, and so it should be governmental because you can watch the park and not pay for it, and therefore it's a terrible thing. You should be forced to pay for it. And also education, which is another big, of course, a very big item. He's in favor of government being up to its neck in for the same reason. But in general, he restricts it more or less to those areas. But my contention is that it can be used, the same argument can be used for almost anything, to justify almost any act of government intervention whatsoever. That Friedman is really unjustly limiting it once you accept the argument. For example, if one of my favorite examples, which I always use in class, is that if people are enjoying, for example, men are enjoying in particular, the sight of girls wearing mini skirts. And of course, this is on the way out. But this is up till now they've been enjoying the sight of girls wearing mini skirts, and they've been enjoying it without paying for it. In other words, here we have this aesthetic benefit or psychic benefit, which we're not being forced to pay for. And so, therefore, the Friedmanite argument should be that we should all be taxed to pay girls to wear miniskirts, and this would iron out the external benefits and smooth out the neighborhood effects. And similarly, this goes for almost anything else. If one of us, for example, becomes a wiser person by reading a great book or something, reading Socrates or whatever, and he becomes wiser by this wisdom, he benefits other people along the way, and therefore they should be taxed to subsidize him reading Socrates, and so forth and so on. It's almost an infinite. And this whole approach seems to me to be very peculiar. In the first place, it really means we should all wear sackcloth and ashes because we're all free riders. This is really an attack on the free rider, but we're all free riders on the discoveries of the past, the writings of the past, the technical inventions, the capital investment of everybody who's gone before us. We're all getting the benefits of this without paying for it, in a sense. And does that mean we should beat our breasts and tear our hair and be taxed by somebody in order to somehow pay for this? To suffer for these benefits that we're enjoying. It's a very peculiar kind of theory. So I'm really saying is that free riding, which Friedman is trying to attack here with the neighborhood effects, is really an essential part of civilization altogether. If we want to abandon free riding, we really have to abandon the fruits of civilization. Now, when I've talked to Chicagoites and Friedmanites about the miniskirt analogy, by the way, they admit that this is correct, but they say they wouldn't push their theory that far. Well, why not? I mean, this is, of course, again, we talk about the role of logic in political policy, and of course, those of us in favor of logic, I think, have a point there. There's another part of the theory that if you're sort of the other side of a coin of the free rider, is that if you can do something which will benefit other people and you're not doing it, they should be able to force you to do it. If you're not conserving copper or something like that sort, and this conservation will help people, you should be able to be forced to do it. My favorite analogy there is the case of three guys who were playing a string quartet. There's a fourth guy who could play the cello, but is sort of recalcitrant and doesn't want to do it. And the theory then should say they should be able to force him to play the cello because this will benefit all three of them. And this, again, is part of the neighborhood. I'm not saying Friedman says this, but I'm saying is he should be saying this if he were a consistent neighborhood effect theorist. So there's so much, I think, for neighborhood effects. But I'm saying this is Friedman's major argument for government intervention in almost any area that he thinks is, the argument applies, such as education. Okay, now to get to a point which I think is probably, this is of course a value judgment, I think it's probably the single most disastrous economic idea ever invented, which is the idea of the negative income tax or the guaranteed annual income. Of course, here again is an interesting situation. Friedman coined the idea of a negative income tax, in other words, a guaranteed minimum income floor for everybody. This became the inspiration for more radical schemes, such as Robert Theobald and the ad hoc committee for the Triple Revolution, and so forth and so on, and also, of course, for Nixon's current welfare program. The problem with a negative income tax is that it provides an income floor by right. In other words, as a rightful claim, as an automatic claim upon production. It no longer becomes the sort of thing we have to go to the welfare department and sort of hat in hand and fill out forms and say you really deserve it, and they don't think you do, and you have to argue about it, which is sort of a degrading thing. Now it becomes automatic. You fill out your income tax form, you say you've gotten less than the prescribed floor, and you get the money in a couple of weeks. Now this, what I'm saying here is that the present welfare system, as crummy as it is, as bad as it is, as inept and as inefficient and bureaucratic as it is precisely saved from disaster by the very ineptness, and its very bureaucracy and very inefficiency. Because it means that the whole system of going on welfare, first place, is chaotic, so it's not automatic. Second place, it's unpleasant. You have to go through all these tin horn bureaucrats to justify being on welfare and get inspected and so forth. And this very unpleasantness provides an extremely necessary disincentive effect to prevent people from going on welfare. This is incidentally the old 19th century laissez-faire liberal position. If you have to have welfare at all, it should be very, very unpleasant, so as to discourage people from going on it. And the Friedman theory, in the name of efficiency and simplicity and automaticity and so forth, eliminates this very essential unpleasant feature. Makes the thing, as I say, automatic. What we have to realize is that there is a supply function or a supply curve for going on welfare. And the various empirical studies have shown the quantitative importance of this. Supply function is essentially this. It's inversely proportional, one to the difference between the prevailing wage rate in the area and the welfare level. In other words, if the prevailing wage rate if the welfare level remains the same, if the prevailing wage rate in the area rises, people start leaving welfare and going on to start working, because the difference between the money they can get from working and the money they get from welfare increases. This gap goes up. So they go off welfare and onto the payroll. If, on the other hand, the welfare level goes up, the prevailing wage remains the same, then they start going on welfare because the amount of money they can get from working, which is generally a pain in the neck, decreases. So the incentive to go on welfare increases. So this means that being on welfare is not somehow a divine act. In other words, it doesn't come from outside the system. Being on welfare is a supply function, and it responds to different incentives and disincentives. And one of the incentives is the prevailing wage rate as compared to the welfare rate, welfare payment rate. And it's also, the supply function of going on welfare is inversely proportional to the cultural disincentive, as we put it. In other words, the stronger the cultural aversion, cultural resistance to being on welfare, the less the people will tend to be on it. This accounts, for example, for the reason why the rural poor, they're much less rural poor going on welfare than urban poor, even though rural poor are just as poor, if not even more so. But in the rural areas, there's a stigma, a general social stigma in the neighborhood for going on welfare. It's generally opposed, and bitterly so, especially by people who are paying for it. In other words, the local folk who are working and paying taxes for it. And so because of the stigma, there are far fewer people go on it. In the urban areas, the stigma tends to be lost, and everybody sort of, it's just, you don't know your neighbor and so forth. And this cultural disincentive then is removed. Also, there was a very charming article a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times. I don't know how many of you have seen it, on the Albanians in New York. The Albanians just had their first church in the world, first Albanian Catholic church in the world. There's a whole discussion of the Albanian community. Apparently, the Albanians in New York are invariably very poor. They're all slum dwellers, and none of them are on welfare. The simple reason, as one Albanian American leader put it, quote, "Albanians do not beg, and to Albanians, taking welfare is like begging on the street, period." So since to the Albanian, being on welfare is like begging on the street, they just are not on welfare, even though their income level is much lower than the average population. The same goes for the Chinese Americans, who are generally poor but almost none on welfare. But I'll get back to the whole welfare question a little bit later. At any rate, the negative income tax, by making the dole automatic, I contend, opens the floodgates to an enormous increase, enormous accession of people living on production. And here I'd recommend Henry Hazlitt's critique of negative income tax in the Freeman about, I think, 4 years ago, July '66. In the first place, what obviously is going to happen if a negative income tax is put in is that the floor, which Friedman sets at essentially $1,500 a year, it's $3,000 with 50% off, so it amounts to $1,500 a year. This floor obviously will start increasing to beat the band at a very rapid rate, because the first thing that people will say is, well, $3,000 is officially considered by the government as the poverty level for a family of four, and therefore you can't subsidize people. We can't have the guaranteed income below the poverty level, and so therefore we have to raise immediately to $3,000 from $1,500. That'll be the first outcry. Secondly, of course, there'll have to be cost of living increases every year, because there'll be inflation every year, and this will add on to the floor. And thirdly, of course, the welfare client organizations are already demanding their so-called right to a guaranteed $6,000 a year income, and this is, so the hopped-up pressure to keep raising the floor almost indefinitely is already underway. So even before the thing has begun. So it's pretty obvious that this floor, starting at a fairly reasonable-looking $1,500, is going to skyrocket very quickly. But there's another point. That's a fairly obvious point. The other point is that who will continue working? Which person who gets below the floor, for example, will keep working? I maintain very few people. In other words, if the floor is $3,000 a year, there'll be very, very few people who keep working at $2,500 a year. But they can just simply quit, work 0 hours a week, sit on the porch and get $3,000 from the government instead of getting $500 from the government. So what I contend is that, well, what happens is if you see the current estimates about the cost of a guaranteed annual income, the costs will look fairly reasonable. $5 billion a year, $10 billion, $15 billion. Doesn't look catastrophic. However, these costs are all based on the assumption that everybody will continue working the same way they're working now. So the disincentive effect, which seems to me will be catastrophic from this sort of thing, are not taken into account. So the fact that you have the guys, if the floor is $3,000, I can tell everybody below $3,000 will quit pretty quickly. If they don't quit, they're pretty screwy. They'll quit. The person getting $3,000 will quit. Or how about people getting above $3,000? Well, they're going to quit too. I mean, because if you're getting, say, $3,500 a year, it means you're working 40 hours a week in order to get $500 a year. That's not very much. So I think people will quit en masse up to at least $4,000, maybe $5,000 a year, something like that. Now, as they quit, this means they have an enormous number of people flooding onto the dole. Somebody's got to pay for this, and of course the person who pays for it is the taxpayer. This means taxes have to be increased very sharply on the guys who are still working. It means the guys getting above $5,000 a year. And as the taxes are increased on them, their after-tax income goes down maybe to $4,000 or $3,000. So they start quitting. So as they start quitting, this floods the roll some more, and then they have to increase the taxes on those continuing to work. Maybe those above $6,000, they start quitting. So what I'm saying is, I envision with a guaranteed annual income a vicious spiral upward or downward, or whatever, until we wind up with everybody on the dole, nobody working, which even the Keynesians can't really cope with. That kind of a system. So I just foresee total disaster with this thing coming into effect. Also, just as another extra sort of tidbit on this, is that the Friedman dole, in addition to the present one, but the Friedman dole is automatic, increases the subsidy per kid, per welfare kid. In other words, a family of 8 people, 6 kids, or 7 kids, or whatever, gets a lot more proportionally than a person with 2 kids. If you're paying people per kid, it means it subsidizes the kid population. In other words, and especially subsidizes the kid population among the poor, the very people who should have less kids, if not more. Now, I don't buy the whole thing about the whole current hysteria about the population bomb and the population explosion. We should all commit suicide in order to stop air pollution and all that sort of thing. I don't go along with that. But surely we shouldn't be deliberately subsidizing more kids among poor people. It seems to me a very peculiar kind of system. But here again, the Friedman's negative income tax would do this as an automatic right. Don't forget. In other words, he couldn't talk to the person saying, maybe you should have a few less kids or something like that. So it'd be considered, and it would be, in effect, an intrusion in their privacy. So therefore, what I'm saying is that it's not true that the Friedman plan, as many conservatives say, would be better, at least than the current system, although not ideal. What I'm saying is it would be much worse than the current system, precisely because it would be efficient, in quotes, and automatic, and guaranteed sort of thing. And this, incidentally, is an example, it seems to me, of Friedman's general penchant for making the existing system more efficient, and by doing it, making it much worse. This is, I think, just one example of this. Also, of course, another point is that in practice, Friedman wants a negative income tax to replace all current welfare systems. You abolish the entire patchwork of welfare programs, and you substitute the negative income tax. In practice, what's going to happen, as we see is already happening with the Nixon program, is that the guaranteed annual income will be added on top of the current welfare stuff. It won't replace anything. Nobody's going to get rid of free lunches for blind mothers and that sort of thing. Nobody. All that's going to stay. On top of that, we're going to get the guaranteed annual income. For example, when the Social Security proposal first came in, the big talking point, one of the big talking points of the Social Security proposal in the 30s was, well, look, here we have a patchwork of existing hodgepodge of inefficient state old age relief programs. Different states paying different amounts, and it's all very peculiar and bureaucratic. Why don't we have a very efficient Social Security system at the federal level? We make each person pay for his old age relief, and that's it. And we can abolish old age relief. So, the thing will really be less costly to the taxpayer than before. That was the big economic talking point. Of course, what happened in practice was that not only the Social Security costs continue to rise astronomically, but old age relief itself is much higher now than it was in the 1930s. In other words, nobody abolished state old age relief. We simply added the Social Security on top of the old programs. This is obviously what's going to happen with a negative income tax. Also, of course, I think it's pretty clear that the so-called requirement of the Nixon program, this is nothing to do with Friedman at this point, but simply the Friedman in action is what the Nixon program really is. The conservative requirement, in quotes, that all able-bodied recipients of the thing have to go to work and have to get a job is obviously a phony. Nobody's going to enforce it. It's going to be just as enforceable as the current. Nowadays, in order to get unemployment insurance relief, unemployment benefits, you're supposed to have to work at whatever the employment service sends you to. Of course, that's obviously a phony. I don't know of any case of anybody's really been forced to work on this basis, because the requirement, of course, is you have to work at a suitable job, or a job that you consider suitable. Of course, you don't consider any job suitable. That's that. It's fairly simple. So this whole thing is obviously just a sop to conservatives. The whole work requirement to sugarcoat the guaranteed annual income program. And also, there's another point about the handicapped people on welfare, and that is that this reduces and this is some Chicago people have done some good work in, I must say. The idea of welfare, automatic welfare dole, reduces the marginal incentive for a handicapped person to invest in his own vocational rehabilitation, because it means that the net economic return he gets from being rehabilitated is much less. He might even disappear altogether if you put him on a guaranteed income. As a result of that, and Estelle James has done some pretty good work on that, the quantitative importance of this policy. As a result of that, the welfare program and the negative income tax program tends to keep people handicapped. In other words, it tends to subsidize them to continue to be handicapped instead of being rehabilitated. And as a matter of fact, in general, the whole problem of welfare dependency will be aggravated by the Friedman plan, because once again, they'll consider this now an automatic right instead of simply, instead of something which they might get or might not get. The proper solution, seems to me, to the whole welfare question is the libertarian solution, which is voluntary welfare rather than governmental welfare altogether. The key here is to promote the idea, which of course almost inevitably has to accompany voluntary charity, because since voluntary charity has a limited budget, they have to start pushing the idea of encouraging self-help, in other words, among the recipients. In other words, helping people, the idea of help them becomes helping people to help themselves, get them on their feet so they can become productive and off the charity roll. Now, this principle was the principle of a famous charity organization society in 19th century England, which was extremely effective. It was a famous laissez-faire principle at the time. And again, the points I raised about the Albanians and the Chinese are going to come in here, because the point is that if people begin to adopt the values of self-help and independence, they will get off the welfare rolls also. This is a tremendous reinforcement of this. And we reinforce these particular values by abandoning government programs and encouraging voluntary programs. For example, the Mormon Church, I understand, has very successful, no Mormons go on welfare either. The Mormon Church has a very successful voluntary welfare program which gives members help in order to get them on their feet. And apparently they're very successful at doing this. Okay, I just also want to say in passing about the negative income tax. The whole idea of it, and the reason why Friedman falls for it, in essence, is because it stems from the old Chicago position of first of all, being in favor of compulsory egalitarianism, or equalization of incomes. This is, again, the Simons position. It's more or less in favor of smashing all, taxing everybody above a certain level and paying everybody below that level. Now, Friedman doesn't go that far, but the point is that there's still this hangover, a remnant of that tradition, in saying that, in separating the micro and the macro. In other words, the idea is you have the micro out here. This is Alfred Marshall in 19th century England and so forth position, the general Anglo-American tradition. You got the micro over here where individual prices are determined by individual supply and demand. That's one sphere. Then you have the macro sphere over here where total price level is determined by the money supply. So and these two things are never really meet. You have the macro out there and you have the micro out there, and that's it. There's no integration. And so the real hidden assumption here of the Friedman position is that you can tax people really as much as you want. It doesn't interfere with their incentives, because their incentives are determined by marginal productivity. It's a different sphere out there. And I'm going to get back to this whole separation thing later when I get to money. Okay, that's the negative income tax. Now we come to a crucial area, I think, where I differ with Friedman, the whole area of money and business cycles, which incidentally is Friedman's major topic of interest. It's the area where he's worst on. It's also his major topic of interest. This incidentally seems to be it happens often in the history of social thought and economic thought and everything else. The area where the particular person happens to be worst on, he sort of pushes for his whole life. And this is a sort of unfortunate development. At any rate, here again, Friedman is essentially almost completely a reversion to Irving Fisher, who wrote, incidentally, from around 1890s to 1920s. Friedman's whole monetary approach, Fisher's whole monetary approach and his whole business cycle approach, which are very, very closely linked, was based again on this Marshallian Anglo-American dichotomy between the micro and the macro. The micro is out here and the micro is out there. Here you have individual prices, which are determined by supply and demand. You let those be determined by the free market. It's a heroic concession of the free market. You let individual prices be determined by the free market. And then over there's the macro level. The macro level, you have this price level. The macro sphere, you have the price level, which is determined by the money supply and velocity. And this is a different situation. Here this is a situation ripe for government intervention, according to the Fisher-Friedman position. So the idea is you have a free market in the micro level, and you have the government up to its hilt, up to its neck in the macro level, and you think that the two of them will never meet. Now this whole approach, this separation, this artificial separation of the micro and the macro, is of course an exquisite contrast to Professor Mises's great achievement in the theory of money and credit, which he began in the theory of money and credit, which is an achievement which has still not been incorporated into Anglo-American economics in almost any sense, of integrating the monetary and the real spheres, in other words, the monetary sphere and the microsphere, integrating them into one system. So, for example, Fisher wrote a famous article in the 1920s, which is recently favorably cited by Friedman, called "The Business Cycle as a Dance of the Dollar." It's a very interesting article. Again, I recommend you reading it because it'll give you the clue to the whole Friedmanite position. And which set the model for the whole Chicago business cycle analysis. In Harberler's book, for example, he says that the founder of the purely monetary theory of the business cycle was Ralph Hortree, an English economist, which is true, but Irving Fisher is just as influential, probably more so in the United States. In this theory, the business cycle then becomes a dance, almost literally. It becomes a kind of a random, uncoordinated, uncaused kind of fluctuation of the price level. And so the key to the whole thing is the price level is somehow moving around. This is a defect of the free market because the free market allows the price level to keep changing in this kind of peculiar, dancey type manner. And the cure then for the business cycle is for the government to step in to take measures to stabilize the price level. In other words, it's to iron out the fluctuations of the price level, to keep the price level constant, and thereby, of course, curing the business cycle, because the business cycle is supposed to be a pure creature of these changes in the price level. And this really remains today, despite modifications, which I'll mention a little later. This remains Friedman's position as well. Friedman is looking for some gimmick, some method of stabilizing the price level. This ideal of stabilizing the price level, of keeping the price level constant, is again linked to Fisher's peculiar view of money, his view of the dollar and the franc and the pound, and the whole monetary philosophy. According to Fisher, the true role of money is to measure values. The idea is the money is supposed to be a measuring stick of some sort, and the price level is supposed to be the thing being measured. So therefore, the price level has to be constant, according to Fisher, in order to fulfill money's true function. Now we know, I don't want to get into the idea why you can't measure values and all the rest of it. I just want to point that out as very different from the Austrian and 19th century position. Now this goal, this idea, somehow this moral ideal of a stable price level is in total contrast to the 19th century approach and the Austrian approach of saying, of hailing, essentially lauding the results of the unhampered free market, which usually almost invariably leads to a falling price level, because usually what happens on the free market is that productivity increases, the supply of goods increases, and the price level falls. Just like TV sets have fallen in price from $2,000 to $60 or whatever over the years. This usually happens for all goods or most goods and services. So Fisher is really standing there in opposition to the system of unhampered free market in the macro sense. In other words, the idea of permitting a falling price level. No, it's a terrible thing. It's immoral. It doesn't measure. You have to have a stable price level. Okay, now this it was Irving Fisher, and Irving Fisher was extremely influential, by the way, and politically and economically. It was his theories and his influence which really provided the main ideological support for the grisly record that Percy Greaves mentioned last meeting about the inflation in the Federal Reserve System during the 1920s. Benjamin Strong, who was the head of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York and the main leader of the Federal Reserve System in the 20s, was guided by Fisher and Hawtrey in his whole economic theory. He's a member of Fisher's nefarious Stable Money Association, which was pushing the idea of a stable price level. And so the idea was they looked at the price level. See, and the price level was represented by wholesale prices, and wholesale prices were either constant during the 20s or they were falling a little bit because of the increased productivity of the economy. And so they said, there isn't any inflation. Why are all these people worrying about inflation? There's no such thing, because if you're looking at the price level, it's falling. That's it. As a matter of fact, they were advocating more inflation. They said it's a terrible thing. The price level is sagging a little bit. Therefore, we have to put more money into the system to raise it. And this was the Fisherite orthodox. This is the position of orthodox economics, when I put it that way, establishment economics, all during the 1920s. And so when people like Professor Mises and a couple of other people warned about the dangers ahead of a recession, an economic crisis, due to the inflation of bank credit, they said, there's no inflation. We're looking at the price level, and the price level is falling. That's it. Even in 1930, Irving Fisher refused to recognize that any depression really existed. He said, no, this is all a temporary jolt in the stock market. Things will bounce up again any minute. And now in his well-known history of his well-known book, Monetary History of the United States, which Friedman wrote a few years ago with Anna Schwartz, he imposes his whole Fisherine theory, his whole Fisherine views upon the American past. If you look at Friedman's position on the 20s, he said he thinks Benjamin Strong was one of the greatest people ever lived, a great price stabilizer, tremendous. And things began to go wrong only after Strong died, and his policies were no longer put into effect. And so Friedman attributes the 1929 depression not to excess inflation, which brings about recession, etc. Quite the contrary. He attributes it to insufficient inflation. He attributes it to the Federal Reserve System not inflating enough in the late 1928-29, and not inflating enough, surely, after 1929. In other words, during the recession, they should have inflated much more. They only inflated a little bit, and they should have inflated a tremendous amount, and it would have solved the whole problem. So while it is true that we monetary malinvestment people have to hail the fact that Friedman has brought money into the discussion at last, after 30 years of being ignored by the Keynesians, who talk only in terms of expenditure, government expenditure and so forth. After hailing this, and after saying, it's a great thing that money is now back in style, so to speak, or back in fashion, we then have to record the fact that Friedman has the exact opposite of the correct theory on money. It's true he talks about money a lot. This theory is the reverse of the correct one, because, as I say, he holds that this stabilization of the price level is the goal of macro policy, and therefore Strong was right and his successors were wrong for not inflating enough. Now, during the 1930s, after the Depression hit, the Fisher view and the Chicago position, Knight and Simons and all these people, University of Chicago, took the position that the way to cure the Depression was to reflate, quote, reflate, unquote, the price level back up to 1920s levels. In other words, somehow keeping the price level constant was no longer good enough. You had to raise the price level back to the 1920s. And doing it in two ways. One, by the Federal Reserve System expanding the money supply through the usual methods. And two, by government deficits and public works programs, expanded public works programs. So in other words, during the early 1930s, if you read the literature in the early 1930s, Fisher and the Chicago people, Knight, Hardy, Simons, and so forth, were considered pretty leftish. They were considered sort of socialistic because they were in favor of big government deficits, inflationary program, public works, and so forth. And indeed, they were. In short, during the early 30s, Fisher and the Chicago School were pre-Keynesian Keynesians. They had the entire Keynesian position without the Keynesian theory behind it. They had another theory behind it, but they had the political program was virtually the same. So what happened was some journal article recently said the reason why the Chicago School was immune to the Keynesian revolution when it finally hit is that the Chicago people were Keynesians anyway. They weren't. Wasn't a big thing to them about expanding and inflating the money supply, expanding deficits, and so forth. So they didn't buy the whole Keynesian theoretical apparatus, as the other people did, because they already were Keynesians politically. They favor the compensatory monetary and fiscal policy and so forth and so on, although they always stressed money as more important than fiscal, but they had both, really, as both arms of it. Now we know, of course, about Friedman's famous position of calling for a continuing steady expansion of the money supply by 3 to 4% a year. He changes the percentages every once in a while. It's a little vague about what percentage he really wants. Somewhere between 3 to 4% per year to be expanded by the Federal Reserve System. We know that is his position, but what we don't realize, many of us, is this is simply a continuation of this older Fisher-Chicago policy with a modification. The modification was he realized that the older policy didn't work very well in practice. In other words, Friedman now says, well, compensatory fiscal policy doesn't work too well, and compensatory monetary policy doesn't work too well because it suffers from these inevitable time lags. You look at the statistics and you see there's a recession in January, let's say. So first of all, it takes about 3-4 months for the statistics to come in. You don't know what's going on until 4 months later. Then it takes about 6 months to decide on what to do. And then after you decide what to do, it takes about 6-7 months before the effect takes place in the economic system. So it's about a year and a half between the time you start doing, between the time you see a crisis developed and the time when the actual policy to counteract the crisis really takes effect. By that time, you're usually in a different phase of the business cycle. So if you're trying to pump in money to counteract a recession, you wind up pumping in money to aggravate a boom, and vice versa. Price level in the short run. We can't have a fine-tuning of the system. But what he wants to do then is to stabilize the price level in the long run. In other words, over the long period, the supply of goods and services goes up something like 2 to 3% per year. Therefore, we pump in the money supply, pump in an increase in money supply by 2 to 3% per year. And we'll get in the long run a stable price level. This glorious ideal stable price level will be fulfilled in the long run. So, therefore, Friedman is really, plainly and simply, to put it very plainly, simply an inflationist, although a more moderate inflationist than the Keynesians. I'll certainly concede him that. Now, in the current period, in the period of the Nixon administration, Friedman has played a very pernicious role, because what happened was that, well, I should say a little bit about the Austrian theory of business cycle. Well, I'll get back to that. What happened was that finally, by June, after the Nixon administration fumbled around for quite a while, by June of '69, they finally stopped increasing the money supply. Happy day finally arrived. For the first time in God knows how many years. Money supply was no longer being increased. As soon as that happened, almost to the minute, Friedman and his disciples immediately launched an hysterical campaign attacking this, saying, no, it's a terrible thing, we'll get a recession. If you don't increase the money supply immediately, increase it by 3 to 4% per year. Don't keep it constant, and so forth and so on. Finally, after months of this, around February, I'm afraid Friedman's campaign bore fruit, and we've begun to loosen up the money supply once more, even though prices are still going up at about an annual rate of about 5%. So it's hardly solved anything. So because of Friedman's happy role in the situation, we now have inflation once again. So what Friedman doesn't understand, and the same thing that Fisher didn't understand 40 years ago, it's still part of the same struggle. What he doesn't understand is the insight that Professor Mises's so-called Austrian business cycle theory provided. And the insight was that the insight which finally integrated the monetary sphere and the real sphere, and it said the following, and very simply. What he doesn't understand is that when you expand credit, this distorts the structure of production. In other words, it distorts relative prices, distorts production. It leads to overinvestment in the higher orders of production in the capital goods sphere and underinvestment in consumer goods. Therefore, and the Friedman people, along with the whole Anglo-American tradition, think that inflation doesn't cause any maladjustments of that type. It simply raises prices, period. It simply raises the price level. However, since we know, as Austrians, we know that it distorts the price level, leads to wasteful malinvestments and overinvestment in the capital goods sphere, this means that, according as Mises and Hayek have shown, this means that the malinvestments generated by the boom have to be liquidated. They must be liquidated. And that once the boom and its wasteful investments have been launched, the recession becomes not only inevitable, but performs a very healthy role, performing the function of cleansing the economy of this wasteful malinvestment and getting us back to free market production. So therefore, according to the Austrian theory, recession is a healthy consequence of the evil malinvestment, so to speak, generated by the inflationary boom. And so what the government policy should be is not to do anything. In other words, allow the recession, first of all, stop the inflation if you're inflating. And if you're in a recession, allow the recession to run its course as quickly as possible, because the more quickly it runs its course, the sooner we get back to a healthy economic situation. So this means that the Austrian prescription is the exact opposite of both the Keynesian and the Friedman prescription for recessions. Not to inflate more, not to keep inflating at 3 to 4% per year, but to stop inflating, period, and keep stopping it. Now the problem is here, again, that Friedman, just as Fisher did 40 years ago, really has no business cycle theory, has no conception of why a boom leads to a bust. It's all sort of a random fluctuation, a random dance of the dollar, and therefore no conception of the healthy function that recessions perform. And so he simply says, well, there's a recession, you pump money in. In essence, if there's too much of inflation, you stop pumping money in. It's a very simplistic view of the business cycle. And incidentally, I should also say here that the Professor Mises' theory is the only theory I think has ever been, as far as I know, has ever been coined, which explains this phenomenon which we've gotten in the last couple of years, which has really hit us during this recession. The phenomenon of prices going up, consumer goods prices going up, at the same time we have recession and unemployment. This is the famous sort of scissors effect. And this phenomenon, of course, puts the establishment economists in a real bind, because all the establishment knows, whether it's monetary establishment or fiscal establishment, all they know is if there's a recession, you pump money in and you spend more. And if there's an inflation, you stop pumping money in, you take some money out. What do you do if both are happening at the same time? What do you do if consumer goods prices are going up? At the same time, there's business failures and unemployment and all the rest of it. And one time during the 1958 recession, I had the occasion to attend a lecture of Professor Burns, who in those days was head of the Council of Economic Advisors. And I asked him this question, because at that time, this phenomenon had appeared already. But so I asked him this question. I said, what would you do? What would you recommend doing in this situation? He said, well, don't worry about it, because we're getting out of the recession very quickly. In a couple of months, it will be over. I said, okay, I concede that. What happens if, some future time we don't get out of it very quickly? Then what? And what he said then, I stayed with me ever since. He says, in that case, we all have to resign, unquote. So I'm calling upon him and the rest of the people out there in Washington to resign, to fulfill this role, resign post-haste. Actually, of course, consumer goods prices always did rise during a recession. The only thing is none of us knew about it. None of us really cared, because all prices in general, were falling because there was a monetary deflation. Every pre-war recession, pre-World War II recession, the money supply would fall and prices would fall. Consumer goods prices wouldn't fall as much as the other prices. And this would perform the same function, the same role of consumer goods prices, in other words, would rise relative to other prices. But nobody worried about it, obviously. Nowadays, of course, with our new, modern, developed scientific system, we don't have any deflation anymore. It's impossible. The government has arranged the banking system in such a way that the money supply can never, ever fall. And so we don't have prices falling anymore. And so we have a phenomenon in recession of consumer goods prices starkly going up. And it, of course, upsets everybody, as well it might. Now, the reason why consumer goods prices go up during a recession, again, has been explained by the Austrian Professor Mises' theory, which is that during a recession, resources have to shift from capital goods to consumer goods, and in doing that, reflecting this higher consumption investment ratio that had been actually the economy had been working on. And in doing that, as resources shift from capital goods to consumer goods prices go up and capital goods prices go down, reflecting this different shift of demand supply. So this is, I say, has always been taking place. It's only now that it's been starkly revealed. Now we've been saved from deflation. It's been starkly revealed we get the worst of both worlds now in our current scientifically organized recession. We have prices going up and unemployment. Of course, another thing is that Friedman has a very mechanical kind of mathematical statistical approach. Tends to ignore the fact that demand for money is not really stable. It varies. It varies really in accordance with expectations of prices going up, and people now finally come to the conclusion. We're now, Professor Mises has talked about the various stages of inflation. We have the first stage, and people think that prices will go back to normal pretty soon. It's the old naive days. Prices are going up, well, it's purely wartime or something, it'll go back soon. We've abandoned that. Now the public has now begun to realize that prices will keep going up forever. Every year we have a 5% increase or something. Once they begin to realize that, the demand for money falls drastically and prices really begin to skyrocket. And we're just about at that point. We're just about reaching phase 2 or whatever of this inflationary process. And this is something Friedman really doesn't take into account, because he doesn't take subjective expectations very much into account. It's all kind of a mechanical theory. You have functions, you have statistics, and it's all correlated, and that's that. Okay, now to get to the last big part here of again, on monetary policy, fiat versus commodity money, another criticism I have of Friedman's position. One of the reasons the Fisher and the Chicago School in the 30s were considered to be radical was because they always were against the gold standard, always chafing under the strength of the gold standard. Friedman, of course, frankly wants to abolish gold altogether as a monetary commodity and replace it with totally fiat currencies. The dollar will be totally fiat, the franc and the mark and so forth and so on. And all of these currencies are supposed to fluctuate freely in relation to each other. Now this change would, again, supposedly this would be more efficient than the present system. You wouldn't have to worry about the balance of payments all the time. There wouldn't be a pound crisis every 2 years and all the rest of it. It would be more efficient in the sense that the exchange rates would then fluctuate in accordance with the monetary issue of each currency. However, even though it would be more efficient, it would be a lot worse. For one thing, it would cut completely every tie to gold, every tie to a commodity money we have now, as weak as the tie is. And for one thing, at least now we have this check on the government that they can't inflate too much because the balance of payments will be pretty embarrassing. Gold will keep flowing out in this kind of embarrassing situation. So at least this has provided a fairly good check on the government in the last few years on inflation. Because one thing that Friedman, of course, doesn't realize is that the government is not sort of a neutral agency, not sort of a neutral instrument for social action. It's essentially a Chicago position. Sometimes they're efficient, sometimes they're inefficient. You sort of take the thing on an ad hoc basis. Government is essentially inherently an inflationary instrument. In other words, my contention is that the inherent tendency of the state is inflation. And if you give to the state, without any check at all, without the gold standard check, the total power, you give to the government the total power to inflate money at will, they're going to do it. They're going to use it. For reasons I'll say in a minute. So what Friedman then advocates is to leave the total absolute dictatorial control of the money supply in the hands of the central government without any check, without any commodity money check, without any international money at all, placing all power in the hands of the government and then trusting the government, urging it to bind itself by these 3% rules, 3-4% per year rules. They're not going to do it. I mean, it's just utopian and unrealistic and kooky to expect that the federal government is going to do this. It's going to first get total power and then hardly use it. And I think we know about power by this time in the 20th century. You know this sort of thing isn't done. The great thing, the major point, the great thing about the gold standard, the critics of the gold standard all say that those of us who are in favor of the gold standard are sort of, gold fetishists. We like to stay there in the closet, at night and run our hands through our gold coins. Gold. That sort of thing. It's a lot of nonsense. I've unfortunately never seen a gold coin. I'd like to. The main reason why we're in favor of the gold standard is because gold is a commodity money. In order to get it, it's costly to get it. You have to dig it out of the ground. That costs a lot. and you have to produce it, sell it, and so forth. This is all costly to discover and mine it, and it creates this market check, an automatic market check on government tendency toward inflation. Whereas fiat paper, government paper, doesn't have this check of high cost and so forth. It's very easy it's almost costless to print money. Also, another point is, I think a very important one, is that money is really a key command post of the entire economic system. Money, of course, is used in every exchange, every transaction, as money is one part of it. So money is the most important single commodity, and he who controls the money supply, I think, is a long way to controlling the whole economic system, regardless of whether you say, well, yes, we're in favor of the free market, or against any intervention except in money. But if you allow intervention in money, you've really got the whole system in your hands anyway. And as I say, Friedman would not only leave this power in the hands of the state, he welcomes it, he's in favor of it. He sort of would shove the power in the hands of the state. It's unlimited power to print money. The state printing of money, and of course of the bank credit based on the controlled banking system, which is really a government operation by this time. This whole system is really nothing more nor less, I think very bluntly, simply legalized counterfeiting. Now, the reason why I think that the inherent tendency of the state is inflation is simply this. If you or I or any one of us or any group of us were given an absolute power, somebody came to us and handed us the printing presses and said, okay, you guys from now on have a complete control of the printing press. You have a compulsory monopoly of the printing presses. You can print whatever you want, whatever money you want. You can use it for any purposes you want. Anybody else who prints it gets shot or gets 30 years in jail. And then it's handed to us. What will we do with it? We print it. We use it. I think it's inevitable. And this is what happens with the government. The government has allocated to itself, arrogated to itself, the compulsory monopoly of the use of the printing press, and so they use it. I think it's simple as all that. And they use it more and more. And it's very easy. You don't have to work. You make money without working for it, without even taxing for it. Taxes are kind of, working is a pain in the neck, and taxing is kind of onerous. It's a pain in other people's neck, and they start complaining. Print money is very simple. Nobody knows about it. It's sort of done in the dark of night. Nobody understands monetary theory anyway. They understand taxes, they don't understand monetary theory. And so it's a very easy, ready thing to do. And then when the state inflates the money supply, and then 6 months later, a year later, prices start going up, the state can always blame other people. Everybody else gets blamed, of course. This is, of course, a characteristic. Speculators get blamed, businessmen, unions, consumers in general. We all know, of course, about these monstrous commercials about don't be piggy. Inflation is caused by all of us are evil because we're piggy. We like to eat. Everybody is to blame. Everybody under the sun has been blamed in the past years, except the government itself, of course. Government is the shining knight in armor, manning the ramparts, always checking inflation and so forth and so on. Actually, of course, they're the ones who are doing it. They're the ones who are inflating. Gold also provides an international money, another, I think, important point. It provides a money for a world market, which we hope someday at least will be in being, a world division of labor, free trade, and so forth. It's really the basis of it. If you have the Friedman idea is that each government prints its own money without any kind of world balancing item or world money. The logic of it, see, it doesn't look so absurd if you look at it just as 80 or 100 countries, whatever it is, each one prints its own money. 100 countries isn't so bad. What happens if you pursue the logic of it a little bit further? What happens if every province produced its own money? Every state, every county, every borough, every municipality, every little village printed its own money, its own currency, that is. I don't mean just has a printing press. It means that the village of Plainfield, the city of Plainfield prints Plainfieldiana notes or whatever. Plainfield, they print 8 Plainfields a week or something like that. And each block print its own money. Each house, each person, even. I print 10 Rothbards, and that's issuing it. Right, not worth too much. Now, the point is, if you have this kind of situation, this is really chaos. I mean, people accuse the market of being chaos. This would really be chaos. You have millions of exchange rates all over the place. You have to consider, let's see, what would 10 Rothbards be worth in terms of 80 Plainfields, that sort of thing. In addition to trying to run a price system, etc. So what you really have with this kind of system is a breaking up of money as a general medium of exchange, which is what money is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a commodity which everybody uses in exchange. Instead of that, you have every little locality printing its own money and so forth. You have the breaking up of a price system, a crippled price system, and really a chaotic situation. I don't think there's any question about it. And the Friedman plan is logically similar, although not quite as absurd because it's quantitatively not as bad. You're only dealing with 120 governments or something instead of 2 million. But the principle is still the same. You're still breaking up the world market. You're still ending the days when you had one commodity or two commodities, gold or silver, being used by every country, which provided a world money for everybody. You're busting up a international division of labor and so forth. And again, I think Friedman arrived at this idea of fluctuating fiat monies because he, just like Fisher 40 years ago, doesn't understand the true nature of money. They think of money as simply a name. The name is there. The money is the dollar or the franc or whatever. They don't understand that money is really basically a commodity or unit. These currencies are units of weight of gold or silver. This is how all these names originated. And where do the names come from? I mean, people didn't all sit down one day in 1790 and say, okay, from now on we call our money dollars, and we start printing them. Dollars were units of weight of gold or silver, and so were francs, and so were pounds, and so forth. As a matter of fact, even now, even in this benighted age, if you look at the statutes of the United States, you see what dollar is defined as. A dollar, it says the dollar is defined as being 1/35 approximately of a gold ounce. In other words, that is the definition of the dollar. So even now, when we're far from a true gold standard, still these currencies are defined in terms of units of weight of gold. As a matter of fact, it was characteristic. It was Fisher's beloved colleague, J. Shield Nicholson, distinguished economist, who wrote a book where he said that money is essentially like dodo bones. In other words, he tried to pick the most useless commodity, useless thing he could think of, dodo bones. He said, well, money's like dodo bones. It's really useless. It's just a name and so forth. Friedman is carrying on that tradition. Now, whether or not, I admit that there's no economic theory doesn't decree that certain given commodity must be money. It could be gold, it could be silver, it could be platinum, it could be something else. The point is, we're now in a specific historical situation. The gold was our money before 1933, and then it was seized from us. It was confiscated. I keep mentioning this. Nobody seems to be even perturbed about this point. It seems to be a rather important one. We were using gold coins before 1933. The government confiscated the coins under the guise of this being necessary to save the banks during this special crisis, the Depression emergency. Well, the Depression emergency has been over for at least 30 years, maybe 38 or something, depending what we're talking about here. And nothing has been done, not one step has been made to return the gold to us. And now that the emergency is over. It's, of course, characteristic of governments to pass emergency legislation that lingers on forever as part of the American tradition. But, where is our gold? The banks have been safe, the Depression emergency is over, etc., and the gold continues in the hands of the government. It seems to me the libertarian monetary policy must be, in addition to not inflating, etc., during inflations and recession, must be first and foremost to get the gold back to us, and make the government disgorge the gold which it stole from us and return it to us. I mean, it's fairly simple as all that. In exchange for the paper that they unloaded upon us, we want the gold back. So the libertarian, it seems to me, must call, not like Friedman does, for the cutting loose totally from gold, but for the restoration of gold to us as the free market money or the people's money, whatever you want to call it, whatever slogan you want to bring to it. And so, in conclusion, on some of the most vital economic issues of our day, Milton Friedman stands in flagrant opposition to economic freedom. His neighborhood effect makes a crucial concession, which in other hands can and does justify almost any type of government intervention in the market economy. His negative income tax proposal has, in the name of efficiency, paved the way for a disastrous measure, guaranteed annual income, that bids fair to wreck our entire economic system. His monetary view, seemingly close to ours, actually provides a rationale for an open invitation to inflation, as well as an apologia for total governmental control of the money supply. Finally, Milton Friedman stands athwart our path, blocking us when we call for restoration of the gold money that was stolen from us in the Depression emergency. In all these crucial cases, Friedman stands in direct opposition to the libertarian solution and the libertarian policy. No, Milton Friedman is not our leader. Thank you. Be trust busted by the government and reduced down the blacksmith shop size so that we can all have perfect competition. We can enjoy the benefits of perfection and competition. And this, I say, was the original Chicago position. It's come quite away from that, happily. And Friedman today doesn't take this position. He says, well, he recognizes that the major source of monopoly today is government privileges, government regulation and subsidies and so forth. But still there's the canker there. The theory is still there. The theory being the Chicago position of perfect competition, in quotes, is better than imperfect. In other words, that a firm with a constant demand curve, a horizontal demand curve, is somehow better and superior and more pure more moral than a firm in a state of which faces a falling demand curve. So this idealization of perfect competition still remains, even though it's played down now in practice in the Friedman position. But it's still there to plague us in the future, because sometime in the future we'll get this. We'll again hear the cry from the Chicago school: such and such a corporation should be broken up because it's too big and it's facing a falling demand curve and so forth. We can expect it at any time. Let's put it that way. Just as Professor Stiegler, Friedman's most distinguished associate, said about 15 years ago, the U.S. Steel should be broken up into its constituent parts because it was monopolistic. I don't know if he still says that. He's come a long way, too, from the last 20 years. But as I say, the theoretical structure still remains. But I don't want to deal too much with monopoly and competition either, because this is, again, more theoretical than a political position at the present time. Let's get to the Friedman's big argument for government intervention in general, which is the so-called neighborhood effect. And it's particularly I want to talk about the external benefit part of neighborhood effect. In other words, the idea that if 2 or 3 people are doing something which another set of people are benefiting from but aren't paying for, this is a terrible, terrible thing, and these people should be forced to pay for it. This is one version of it. Now, in practice, Friedman doesn't push this to a great extent. He essentially says, well, this is really limited. We limit the application of this to urban parks, Central Park, and so it should be governmental because you can watch the park and not pay for it, and therefore it's a terrible thing. You should be forced to pay for it. And also education, which is another big, of course, a very big item. He's in favor of government being up to its neck in for the same reason. But in general, he restricts it more or less to those areas. But my contention is that it can be used, the same argument can be used for almost anything, to justify almost any act of government intervention whatsoever. That Friedman is really unjustly limiting it once you accept the argument. For example, if one of my favorite examples, which I always use in class, is that if people are enjoying, for example, men are enjoying in particular, the sight of girls wearing miniskirts. And of course, this is on the way out. But this is up till now they've been enjoying the sight of girls wearing miniskirts, and they've been enjoying it without paying for it. In other words, here we have this aesthetic benefit or psychic benefit, which we're not being forced to pay for. And so, therefore, the Friedmanite argument should be that we should all be taxed to pay girls to wear miniskirts, and this would iron out the external benefits and smooth out the neighborhood effects. And similarly, this goes for almost anything else. If one of us, for example, becomes a wiser person by reading a great book or something, reading Socrates or whatever, and he becomes wiser by this wisdom, he benefits other people along the way, and therefore they should be taxed to subsidize him reading Socrates, and so forth and so on. It's almost an infinite. And this whole approach seems to me to be very peculiar. In the first place, it really means we should all wear sackcloth and ashes because we're all free riders. This is really an attack on the free rider, but we're all free riders on the discoveries of the past, the writings of the past, the technical inventions, the capital investment of everybody who's gone before us. We're all getting the benefits of this without paying for it, in a sense. And does that mean we should beat our breasts and tear our hair and be taxed by somebody in order to somehow pay for this? To suffer for these benefits that we're enjoying. It's a very peculiar kind of theory. So what I'm really saying is that free riding, which Friedman is trying to attack here with the neighborhood effects, is really an essential part of civilization altogether. If we want to abandon free riding, we really have to abandon the fruits of civilization. Now, when I've talked to Chicagoites, Friedmanites, about the miniskirt analogy, by the way, they admit that this is correct, but they say they wouldn't push their theory that far. Well, why not? I mean, this is, of course, again, we talk about the role of logic in political policy, and of course, those of us in favor of logic, I think, have a point there. There's another part of the theory that if you're sort of the other side of the coin of the free rider, is that if you can do something which will benefit other people and you're not doing it, they should be able to force you to do it. If you're not conserving copper or something like that sort, and this conservation will help people, they should be able to be forced to do it. My favorite analogy there is the case of three guys who are playing a string quartet. There's a fourth guy who could play the cello, but is sort of recalcitrant and doesn't want to do it. And the theory then should say they should be able to force him to play the cello because this will benefit all three of them. And this, again, is part of the neighbor. I'm not saying Friedman says this, but I'm saying is he should be saying this if he were a consistent neighborhood effect theorist. So this is so much, I think, for neighborhood effects. But I'm saying this is Friedman's major argument for government intervention in almost any area that he thinks is, the argument applies, such as education. Okay, now to get to a point, which I think is probably, this is of course a value judgment, I think it's probably the single most disastrous economic idea ever invented, which is the idea of the negative income tax or the guaranteed annual income. Of course, here again is an interesting situation. Friedman coined the idea of the negative income tax. In other words, a guaranteed minimum income floor for everybody. This became the inspiration for more radical schemes, such as Robert Theobald and the ad hoc committee of the Triple Revolution, and so forth and so on, and also, of course, for Nixon's current welfare program. The problem with the negative income tax is that it provides an income floor by right. In other words, as a 6% a year, obviously you have to ask a lot more than 6% to overcome the inflation. So Friedman's supposed to have this great new discovery, and the economics profession now sort of in a tizzy about that. And of course, Fisher had said exactly the same thing about 40, 50 years ago, and Professor Mises has said the same thing in his work and so forth. But they say the collective memory of the press and the economics profession is very, very short. And this is, as I will point out later on, this is true of Fisher's, Friedman's general theory about money in the business cycle. It's essentially Fisher rediscovered and with a lot of statistics added onto it. I'm going to talk tonight essentially about the political rather than the methodological critique of Friedman. I could say a lot about the methodology, but I think in this sort of gathering, I think we can stress the political economy aspect. I just want to say in passing that Friedman is probably the outstanding proponent in methodology of an extreme variant of logical positivism. In other words, the major opponent of Professor Mises' methodology, so to speak. Friedman is so extreme that he says that a theoretical assumption not only doesn't have to be proven, it can even be false and still be a correct theory. It doesn't matter if the assumptions are false, he says, as long as the predictions are correct, which are based on these false assumptions. So this is an extreme version of positivist methodology, and I'm saying this is the exact counter to everything that praxeology holds dear. But as I say, I don't want to talk about methodology tonight. I just want to mention that in passing. First, and I'm not going to deal too much with this either, is the whole field of monopoly and competition. Now, it's true that in practice, Friedman has come a long way from the original Henry Simon's position. The original Henry Simon's position, which was written in a really screwball book, I think in 1934, called A Positive Program for Laissez-Faire, which I recommend everybody read because it really states the Chicago school position very clearly, the political position of the Chicago school, with great clarity. And essentially Simon said was that every corporation above the size of a small blacksmith shop should be broken up. The pleasure of being here again. I'm not quite of Milton Friedman's generation. It's sort of a petty point. I'm a little bit younger than he is. Insert that into the record. I think a lot of people seem to have been afflicted with an excess of Friedman worship. So I'm not going to stress the good points that Friedman has done in the past few years. I think most people are familiar with it. I might even be so unkind as to paraphrase when Friedman's mentor Henry Simons wrote an article about Alvin Hansen one time. Hansen being the top left-wing Keynesian in the past years, now more or less retired. He wrote an article saying, he began the article by saying, "I come to bury Hansen, not to praise him." And I can say the same thing about Friedman tonight. In the first place, one of the problems with the press in general is that the press has a very short memory. So if somebody comes up with an idea and nobody said it for the last 3 years, it's immediately hailed as a great new idea, a great new discovery. And the same thing has happened to Friedman. Almost everything he says is a complete reincarnation of what, for example, Irving Fisher had said 40 years ago, 30 years ago. But since the collective memory of the press and even the economics profession is very short, nobody points this out. So Friedman has discovered all sorts of so-called laws, which are simply rediscoveries or restatements of what Fisher had said clearer, more in a clearer fashion 40 years before. For example, there's a famous law that Friedman is supposed to have discovered a year or two ago, that the interest rate rises during inflation, especially during the later stages of inflation, because as prices are going up, we have a discount, a positive price discount premium, or a positive price premium on the interest rate to account for the prices rising. So that if the creditor is demanding a 6% return, for example, and prices are going up